Welcome to Deep or Nothing with Miss Daisy O, the podcast where we explore the art of deep thinking. Join me as we dive into thought provoking conversations that challenge the surface and uncover the profound truths that shape our lives.
Hi, deep thinkers. How you doing? I hope that you're keeping your body, mind, and soul right. You know what they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And they also say the first wealth is health. I'm sure they also say prevention is better than cure, and the healthy outside starts from the inside. So, I know I won't get a feedback, but I'm choosing to trust you. I think all I'm just saying is, I really hope that you're okay.
So, check this out. I've been witnessing some things around me lately happening to people that I know, and it's very familiar to me as well. It's even more serious now because life has become increasingly demanding. From the fast pace of work environments, pressure of personal responsibilities to multiple messaging platforms. Let me share a quick story. A friend I had not seen in a long time informed me that she'd be visiting the country that I reside in, and I was so excited. I had dropped her a message in the month she was to arrive, and it was left unread for a while. She eventually messaged me and apologized for not responding, and she told me one thing, the realest thing I heard from anyone that week. In her exact words, keeping up is a real hustle. Away from quick meetups, some of us genuinely experience situations that cause us to question our importance to people who are dear to us. You send someone a message, they reply with one word. Immediately, something shifts. Yesterday, they sounded excited. Today, they seem distant. Then you replay yesterday's conversation in your mind. You're wondering if you said something wrong. And it's not just texting. Someone walks past you without smiling, or someone laughs less than usual around you, someone forgets to call you back, or someone seems quieter than normal. In fact, they forget to ask you about the important things that matter to you. And almost instinctively, we begin writing a story. So my first question for you today is, have you ever left a conversation wondering, did I do something wrong? When did we start believing that consistency means behaving the same way every day? And maybe the real problem is not that people are changing as frequently as we think they are. Maybe it's that we've quietly come to expect emotional consistency. And that's why today's episode surrounds the unrealistic expectation of emotional consistency. Before I get into this, for the sake of this episode, when I use the word relationship, I'm referring to every kind of relationship: friendships, romantic relationships, family relationships, professional relationships, every form of human connection. One thing I've noticed is that we enter most relationships without ever communicating what our expectations actually are. Well, in some business relationships, right, expectations are written down, agreed upon, and then they're signed. Everyone knows what is expected of them. But in many other relationships, especially romantic relationships, people simply assume both parties are operating from the same script. This same script that we inherited from society, culture, from films, social media, and even our own upbringing. Friendships are much different. We meet someone, we naturally connect with the person, and over time, that person simply becomes part of our lives. Other kinds of relationships develop their own characteristics too. Human beings, as we know, are meaning making creatures. We don't just experience the world, we interpret it. And once we interpret it, we begin to predict it. Expectations most times are born out of the meanings that we've assigned to our experiences and then the repetition that reinforces those meanings. One reason inconsistency affects us so deeply is because the human mind is constantly trying to predict what comes next. And that's because predictability gives us a sense of safety, right? When people behave in ways that become familiar, our brains just begin to expect those behaviors to continue. And that's also how trust is built. That's how routines are formed. That's how comfort develops. So when someone suddenly behaves differently, our minds don't immediately ask, what might they be going through? Instead, we habitually ask, what changed? Or even worse, did I do something wrong? We by nature search for an explanation because uncertainty is very uncomfortable. And the problem is that in our attempt to make sense of the change, we usually mistake a temporary human moment for a permanent change in the relationship. Now, let me be clear. It is completely natural to have expectations. Expectations are not the problem. The problem is when our expectations quietly become assumptions, and then our assumptions become the lens through which we judge other people. That's when they begin to affect not just our relationships, but our entire view of people and even the world around us. With people who are close to us, we unconsciously expect emotional consistency. We don't simply expect people to love us, we expect them to express that love identically every single day. We expect the same energy, same enthusiasm, patience, the same availability, even the same emotional capacity every single day. What I'm trying to do with this episode is remind you that it is an impossible expectation, not because people don't love you, but because people are human. And expecting a human being to show up with the same emotional capacity every day is like expecting life itself to never fluctuate. I think this single expectation has quietly cost many of us peace and relationships that may never have been in as much danger as we imagined. A reason this happens is because we commonly confuse behavior with identity. Now, it can be argued that people behave according to who they are. And to an extent, that's true. Behavior does tell us something about a person, but I don't think it tells us everything. One thing that makes this important is a simple reality. No one has direct access to another person's internal experience. We only ever have direct access to what they do. Everything that follows, everything else is interpretation. That's why behavior and interpretation are inseparable. One person acts, another person assigns meaning to that action. For example, yeah, I could move my leg away because I'm in pain, while you interpret it as me not wanting to sit close to you. The action is the same, the meaning is completely different. And that brings me to one of the biggest gaps in human relationships, the gap between intention and action. People experience our actions, we experience our intentions. And that's why misunderstanding happens so early. We're judging people by what we observed, while they are judging themselves by what they meant. A person's behavior can change, but their character doesn't necessarily change. A person can be tired, you can find them grieving, they can be overwhelmed sometimes, distracted, or even mentally exhausted without loving you any less. This is where I think many of us make a mistake. We expect consistency from people's emotions, when maybe what we should be looking for is consistency of their character. Those are two very different things. For example, I can love you deeply and still have a terrible day. I can value you immensely and still be quiet today. I can respect you and still disappoint you. I mean, I can care for you and still not have the capacity to express it the same way every time. There are days I don't want to get on a phone call, not because I don't want to talk to people, but because I don't quite feel like it. Behavior is usually situational, character is foundational. Behavior can change with circumstances, character usually changes much more slowly. The danger is that many of us use temporary behavior to make permanent conclusions about a person's character. Then we forget something equally important. People are different versions of themselves across different days. Let's be sincere. Nobody wakes up identical every morning. Every day, people carry different things, different energy, different fears, physical health, disappointments, different mental capacity. We unconsciously begin interpreting every different impression as a different relationship. And that's dangerous. You can't meet a person the same way every day. Not because they become someone else, but because today is not yesterday. You never really meet the exact same version of a person twice. What you meet is the same identity expressed through a different day's experience. And yet, we expect people to respond with the same enthusiasm, the same patience, and emotional availability every single day. And that's an impossible expectation because life itself happens in seasons. People mature, people heal, people struggle, they evolve. And you need to understand that identity develops over time. Every human being, including you, is continually becoming. I think one of the biggest reasons we arrive at these conclusions is because of a double standard that almost all of us live by without realizing it. A lot of us give ourselves permission to be human, but we rarely extend that same permission to other people. Let me give you instances, right? When I'm quiet, I'm just stressed. But when you are quiet, you're avoiding me. When I'm distant, for example, I've had a long day. When you are distant, I interpret it to mean you've changed. When I forget to reply, life has just been hectic about a very long day. But when you forget to reply, clearly I'm not that important to you. When I cancel plans, I'm mentally exhausted. When you cancel plans, you don't value my time. Do you see what we're doing? When it comes to ourselves, we automatically search for context. When it comes to other people, we just naturally search for conclusions. So it turns out that we become incredibly compassionate with our own circumstances. Yet, we're confident in our interpretation of someone else's behavior. The true story here is we know the story behind our own actions. We don't know the story behind theirs. And because the human mind dislikes uncertainty, it starts to fill in the gaps, usually with a story that places us at the center of that explanation. And that's why we interpret ourselves through context and everyone else through behavior. And then relationships begin to collapse under these same interpretations. It is where assumptions quietly become designers of the relationship. The danger with assumptions is that they don't remain assumptions for very long. If they go unchallenged, they slowly begin to feel like facts. And before long, you're no longer responding to the person in front of you. You're responding to the story that you've created about them.
Enjoying the podcast? Follow and turn on notifications for new episodes weekly.
Welcome back to Deep or Nothing with Miss Daisy O. Let's face facts. Some relationships don't experience tension or even end because people stopped caring. Sometimes they begin to fall apart because someone mistook ordinary human variation for changed intention. Someone texted shorter than usual, or someone didn't laugh, or they forgot something, or they sounded tired, or maybe someone was not even as expressive as they normally are. And immediately, the story begins. Oh, you've changed. You're no longer interested. You don't value this relationship anymore. Something must be wrong between both of us. But what if none of those stories are true? Have you ever given it a thought? Maybe they haven't changed. Maybe today they're simply human. Maybe life asks more of them today than it did yesterday. Or maybe they're carrying something they haven't found the words to tell you. Maybe we're not actually responding to what happened. Maybe we're responding to the meaning we've assigned to what happened. And once meaning changes, behavior usually follows. You become more guarded, you withdraw a little, you stop reaching out the way you used to reach out. The other person notices that change in you, but they also don't know your story. Now they begin interpreting your behavior. And just like that, two people who still care about each other can slowly begin responding to interpretations instead of reality. Sometimes, right, the relationship did not change first. The story did. I think there's a distinction we don't naturally make. And because we don't make it, we don't create room for it in our relationships. And it's that distinction between emotional consistency and relational consistency. Those two things are not the same thing. We've somehow come to expect that if someone loves us, they'll feel the same way, respond the same way and they would even show up the same way every single day. What if that's not what consistency was ever supposed to mean? What if this love we're talking about is not, I feel exactly the same way about you every day? What if love is, I continue choosing this relationship even on the days I don't have my full emotional capacity? Because if we're being honest, there are days when we're simply not the full version of ourselves. There are days when our minds are occupied, when work drains us. There are days when grief is just louder than conversation and we're physically present, but we're emotionally exhausted. There are days when we're trying to survive more than we're trying to socialize. And none of those days automatically mean that we've stopped caring. Within relationships, I think consistency is better understood as commitment than mood because mood fluctuates. Capacity also does. Energy fluctuates. Attention isn't the same. Life fluctuates. But commitment is what remains under those fluctuations. And that's why I think it's unfair to expect a human being's emotional store to always be full. Nobody has unlimited patience. No one has unlimited attention or unlimited enthusiasm, not even unlimited emotional availability. Sometimes people are pouring from abundance, and other times they're simply trying to not pour from emptiness. The mistake that we commonly make is expecting people to give us from a place they themselves may not be standing in. You can't give what you don't have. And maybe that's where giving room for humanity begins. Not expecting people to be emotionally identical every day, but trusting that a temporary reduction in emotional capacity is not automatically a reduction in love, in care, or even commitment. Now, I want you to ask yourself something. Am I truly giving room for humanity? Or am I relating more to my idea of what a person should be than to the person who actually exists? Because there's a difference, you know? If you've ever canceled a meeting because you were tired, if you've ever replied to a message hours later because life became overwhelming, if you've ever forgotten to return a call, or you've ever simply not had the emotional energy to show up the way you normally would, then you've already experienced what it means to be human. So, why is it sometimes so difficult to believe that someone else might be experiencing that very same thing? If you can explain your own behavior through context, but only explain someone else's behavior through conclusions, then maybe you're not giving them the same permission to be human that you naturally give yourself. And I need to tell you something that I think every relationship eventually teaches us. Every relationship reaches the point where the other person stops behaving the way you expect. You can't change that. It's not something that you can control. And this is not because they stopped caring. It's just because expectations eventually would always collide with reality. I would like to stay on the word expectation for a while. I would like to ask questions around that. What are your expectations actually measured against? I'll answer it. These answers are simple, right? It's what you've known, what is familiar to you, what you've experienced, what you've hoped for. In many ways, your expectations are deeply influenced by your own reality. But what you fail to hold closely is your reality isn't the other person's reality. They're carrying experiences you don't have. They're carrying responsibilities you don't carry, battles you don't see, emotions you don't fully access. So maybe the question isn't simply whether they've changed. Perhaps the question is whether your expectations ever made room for the fact that they were always going to be human. Which leads me to another question. Do you love people? Or do you love the version of them that is easiest for you to receive? Have you mistaken emotional fluctuation for emotional withdrawal? Because those two things are not always the same. And sometimes the greatest act of love isn't fixing the moment. Sometimes it's refusing to panic because someone had an ordinary human moment. Even if in that moment it means your own emotional need isn't immediately met. Sometimes love waits. Sometimes love gives people room to return to themselves. And not everyone who behaves differently feels differently. Not every quiet day is rejection. Not every delayed reply is distance. Not every bad day is a different person. Sometimes you're simply meeting the part of them that life produced that day, that season, that moment in time. And that's not necessarily the moment love is tested. It may simply be the moment you're finally meeting the whole person, not just the version of them that had the energy to make you comfortable. And see, this episode is not about inconsistency. It's about giving people permission to remain human without assuming that they've become different people. If only we'd acknowledge how inconsistent we all are. Can any of us truly be emotionally consistent every single day? Especially when there are countless external factors influencing our behavior, our perception, and even expectations, or our capacity, even. One thing I do is this: on days when it seems obvious that I have been neglected, taken for granted, or simply not treated as importantly as I expected, I ask myself one question: what truth do I know about this person? Not today, fundamentally, who have they consistently shown themselves to be? You see that question? It helps me separate a moment from a pattern. It allows me to move beyond the disappointment of the moment without immediately rewriting the relationship. Now, that isn't to say there aren't situations where your concerns are valid. There are. I'll be a fool to say there aren't, especially when what you're experiencing is not an isolated moment, but a repeated pattern. Because patterns reveal something that isolated moments ordinarily cannot. They tell us something more reliable about a person's character. So if you've observed consistent patterns that threaten your peace, your emotional well-being, or your safety, then by all means, make that decision that protects yourself. But staying with the central point of today's episode, consistency isn't behaving the same way every day. It's remaining committed to the same person despite not feeling the same every day. Maybe maturity in relationships isn't learning how to read people better. Maybe it's learning not to overread them.
Let's go deep, or not at all.